Today, I'll be talking to Rachel Vanderpool about the impact of racism on food choices in communities of color. Let me introduce her briefly before I bring her on. Rachel Vanderpool Rosario is a registered dietitian and nutritionist with an integrative approach. She has a virtual practice called Insight Nutrition and Wellness Counseling. Rachel offers nutritional therapy and counseling for gastrointestinal disorders, autoimmune hypothyroid, depression, anxiety, and general wellness. Rachel identifies as Afro-Dominican and is passionate about maintaining traditional foodways as part of a healthy diet and lifestyle. So, hi, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast interview. It's so good to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited for this topic.
Me too. So I just shared a little bit about your background and your expertise, but also you're one of the few dietitians of color. Why is that? And what's the connection between racism and food choices?
That's an excellent question. Well, when it comes to why there's so few dietitians of color, I think that there are many different factors that come into that. The first being that, we kind of tend to follow into career choices that we see practiced in our own communities. So unfortunately, because there's a lack of dietitians of color to begin with, many of us don't think that that's an actual career path that we need to follow. Me being the child of immigrant parents, most of the time our parents want us to go into either medicine or be a lawyer or an engineer. Those are kind of the classic three. So dietitian tends to fall pretty short on the list, if any. The other reason is that when it comes to the academics for becoming a registered dietitian, you typically go through the 4 years as an undergrad, or some folks choose to do their typical master's. But then after that academic process is completed, then there's an internship process that has to follow in order for you to qualify to sit for the national board exam. And that internship is, for the large part, unpaid. So that's a huge issue for a lot of folks of color, especially if we're coming from families who, don't have a lot of wealth to be able to support, somebody working essentially for anywhere from 10 to 12 months in an unpaid internship. And that internship is typically the equivalent of a full-time position, 40 hours a week. So when I did my internship, I had to work part-time on top of 40 hours a week just so that I could afford the apartment that I was living in and to purchase food and things like that. So I think that that's another large reason. And then the third is that I think that there may also, I'm not entirely sure if this is the case, but I suspect that there may also be a retention issue, because since there aren't many people of color who are in academic positions teaching students, and because there's not a lot of students and there's not a lot of people in the field, the impact of not seeing yourself reflected in those spaces weighs very heavy. When I was in my internship, I was the only student of color out of a class of 12. I had 45 supervisors, of which 3 were of color. And the most amount of time I got to spend with each of those preceptors was 1 day. So I was studying in Charlottesville, Virginia, so a very small college town in the South. So being surrounded in this predominantly white institution, predominantly white preceptors, students as well, weighed very heavy on me. And that was actually my first experience with recognizing my own issues with anxiety and depression. I almost left that program because I was struggling with meeting the requirements of my program, because I felt so alone and so not visible, because I didn't see myself reflected in a lot of the spaces where I was going to serve people, and where, ironically, a lot of the patients we were serving were people of color.
Wow. Wow, that's really interesting. And this whole concept of unpaid internship is set up to really disenfranchise some of the people that can't afford to have those unpaid internships. And I know going through graduate school, I myself had to do that. And it is a very difficult thing. And so we end up taking loans. We end up working more and stressing ourselves out, which could lead to depression and anxiety. So that definitely is an unbiased system. And I hope it changes and is eradicated.
Yeah, I think it's going to take a lot of work. And I think a lot of that work, there are a group of dietitians who identify as color who are trying to address that need for supporting students coming into the profession so that we can increase our numbers. But the majority of that work shouldn't fall on us. That work also needs to be taken up, by people who are white identifying, to create more opportunities, to create more equity, to create more space, so that people from diverse backgrounds, whether it's racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic, can also participate in these spaces and serve communities where, we're receiving a large part of, this medical nutritional care.
Is that an issue with the communities of color as far as diet and nutrition? I mean, there's the issue of cost in some communities, and then there's lack of availability of organic and healthy foods. I mean, there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of more processed foods and a lot of more fast foods in some communities. Is that an issue, and is that something you as a dietitian have to deal with?
Absolutely. As a dietitian and as a person of color as well, living in these communities, yes, absolutely. One of the things is that yes, we have there's an income gap, there's a wealth gap, and there's an issue of access to food. So I remember in our nutrition courses, we would often, whenever we would talk about minority populations, there was always this conversation about how we're the highest, especially people of Black and African and Latino ancestry, we are the highest risk for diabetes, for hypertension, for renal issues, et cetera. And all of these are conditions that require a large amount of nutrition as part of the preventative measures for managing those conditions once the onset is there. Oftentimes, our communities get spoken about as something called a food desert. And I take huge issue with that term because the idea of a food desert, so the concept of a food desert, for those who don't know, is the idea that within a certain radius of where you live, that there is a lack of spaces that sell fresh food, that food is not as available. I believe the radius is typically anywhere within like 5 miles, but it could be, larger depending on different communities. But and there are actively many food deserts, including even in major cities. So I currently live in Boston, and Boston has identified several food deserts within the city itself. And you would think, with an area that is high population density, with public transit, there's not as much of a need for cars. It's kind of ironic that there's still this issue, but yet it's there. But in any case, the issue with the term of food desert is that with the word desert, it kind of implies that there's a natural phenomenon, right? And if there's a natural phenomenon, like, what could we do to possibly withstand that? There's a activist and grower by the name of Dara Cooper who coined the term food apartheid as a much more accurate way of describing what happens in these communities, in these BIPOC communities, where there's lack of access to food. And the reason that the term food apartheid was chosen is because now that highlights that this is a man-made phenomenon. This isn't the natural thing. That because of different processes throughout history, such as redlining for residential areas and lack of access for home ownership to Black and Brown communities, because of the way that land access is not easily accessible to Brown and Black communities, that the majority of land access ends up going to developers to create condos and things like that. Or if something's being zoned for agricultural, loans are much more easily accessible for white farmers versus Black and Brown farmers, et cetera. And so what ends up happening is you have this condition where that access to fresh food becomes further and further away from the populations that are at most risk and that are at most in need of that nutritious food. And granted, we all need nutritious food, but it's just interesting to see how the lack of access to purchase food and the lack of access to even grow your own food because you can't access land to grow your food becomes such an issue in these communities.
Wow. I live in Arizona, and right now a lot of the farmers are kind of freaking out because a lot of developers are buying all that land. And we're hearing a lot about the wealthy, like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and everybody else, all these wealthy people buying a ton of land, which could have been agricultural land. And the whole goal, I guess, is that whoever controls the food controls the population. And
Mm-hmm.
you're here talking about specifically with communities of color where they're already being deprived of a lot. And then there's these food deserts that are going on. I'm really concerned because I feel like right now I'm hearing a lot about the farming strike that's going on in India
Mm.
and how they're really trying to preserve integrity in farming and for us to continue to have healthy foods that's not tampered with. And yet right now we're seeing pockets of it around the world, but I feel like that will be the goal of taking over farming, right? So there's a lot going on here that's connected. And I'm really concerned because there's a direct connection between food and mood when it comes to the foods we eat impacts our mental health and well-being. And so
Right.
if we're not getting the nutrients, we're going to have a pandemic of mental illness. And if this is happening, if the direction and the trend is going towards the wealthy buying up the land, the small farmers really don't have a chance. So what are we supposed to do, whether we're communities of color or just wanting to take back control of our food production? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. There's a couple of different ways that there are communities who are actively addressing this issue. And granted, a lot of this is very much on the small scale because that's where you affect the most changes. You kind of have to start in your own backyard and then grow from there. So there's this phenomenon, particularly it looks like I live in an urban environment. So we have this concept of urban farms that are popping up more and more in areas as a way of taking back some land that is not being used, that can be very well rehabilitated so that it can produce food, and then providing that food to the communities that are in most need. So, for example, I participate with a local urban farm by the name of Oasis in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And so we took this small plot of land that wasn't really being used more than just, a neighborhood dump site for, in reality. And a couple of years ago, a group of concerned neighbors were able to appeal to the city of Boston to put that land into a land trust so that the neighborhood could rehabilitate it and use it to grow produce. And so that produce is sold at a local farmers market to the actual residents of the Dorchester area, which is one of the most notably largest communities of Black and Latino populations in the area, and of the lowest income as well. So we do have this concept of urban farms. We do also have in other spaces where there is a little bit more land available, another sense of reclaiming that land. So I know that there's several efforts out in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., where they're also building farms to serve Black and Brown and Indigenous communities as well. The next step up from that is the sense of having some type of a cooperative where you have, different farmers, different growers banding together to pool their resources so that there can be greater access to food, greater access to knowledge. And that's really the biggest piece as people of color that is, in my opinion, the most harmful that we lose is not just the access to nutritious foods, but the access to our ancestral foods, right? So the foods that, we have been eating for thousands and thousands of years that because of, resettling in other areas and through, history, we either have been denied that access to have those foods or to grow those foods, or there's this interesting thing that happens as far as nutrition goes where we don't see those foods reflected in a healthy diet scheme, right? So for example, my family being from the Dominican Republic, plantains are a very big staple part of our diet. Plantains are very nutritious, high in fiber, high in vitamins, high in minerals. Green plantains are very low glycemic, so they're great for helping to regulate blood sugar. And yet now we're seeing plantains being touted as one of the newest superfood trends. So this is another thing that happens with our foods is we're not shown access to that as part of like a healthy plate until then somebody figures out, oh, this is a new marketing strategy, or here's a new marketing strategy for new food so that we can, boost sales in our supermarkets and things like that. We saw it with quinoa several years ago. Once quinoa was labeled as the new superfood, it's a grain high in protein and this, and that. The prices of quinoa skyrocketed. And then the indigenous communities that grew that quinoa were suddenly in a position where they were having difficulty even buying the own product that they were producing themselves. So we're seeing this destruction happen, not just here in the US, but also the repercussions of it abroad when we can't, have a say in our own foods and how they're reflected and how they're marketed and how they're branded in our supermarkets. So that's really troubling as well.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is definitely a serious topic, and I think I'm passionate about it because it's so important for us to have this control over our food because it does affect our mood and our mental health. One thing that really interested me about what you're talking about is this concept of ancestral foods. Can you, like you did mention the plantains and the quinoa, how is that connected to the communities of color, and how can we shed more light on ancestral foods as well as just what's going on with the food scarcity in communities of color?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I know that a couple episodes ago you had a speaker talk about, neuroprotective foods for folks who have anxiety and things like that. And that's great. And it turns out a lot of our ancestral foods also are very either neuroprotective or also very good for our digestion, which has a huge impact on our microbiome, which has a huge impact on our mental health. So like I had mentioned, like with plantains, they're a resistant starch in particular, which helps to feed our microbiome to produce short chain fatty acids such as butyrate, which is really great at regulating mood and cognition. As people of color, even white people, I would say, can be interested in this as well. But, spending that time and learning more about some of these ancestral foods that we are finding ourselves kind of either moving away from or we don't see reflected in the nutrition landscape. So, for example, I work with a lot of digestive issues, and one of the therapeutic diets that's used quite often, particularly for cases of IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, is the low FODMAP diet. And so the low FODMAP diet essentially categorizes different types of carbohydrates depending on the fermentable fiber type as a way of kind of determining like what triggers a person's IBS symptoms. And there are several databases where folks can, kind of look up, oh, is this food high in FODMAP or is this low in FODMAP and is this okay for me? And when you look through those, a lot of our ancestral foods are not reflected on there. So for example, like nopales, which is this is from like the Central American, American Southwest area. Those are really high in fiber. They're an antimicrobial, they're an antiviral, and they're not reflected in something like that.
So, I mean, one thing you're saying is I'm finding a lot of these, I guess we can call it ancestral foods,
Mm-hmm.
traditional foods and specific not restaurants, but grocery stores, like
Mm-hmm.
where the Mexicans are shopping. That's where you'll find a lot of Mexican and indigenous foods to the Mexican culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also have a place here called Asiana, and there's a lot of Asian inspired fruits and vegetables or fruits and vegetables that are native to what they're eating. And so you can find things like that over there. And then I also go to the Arab store to get some of the things that I need culturally for us. And then when we go to California, we go to the Afghan and the Iranian stores to get the stuff that we need. So would you say that that's a solution, or should we just have this more mainstream in our grocery stores?
Yeah, so having resources within our communities where we can access those foods, like having, for lack of a better term, those ethnic stores where we can purchase those things, checking in with local growers because they may be actually producing some of those foods that we are used to. So, for example, okra is a really big staple in African communities. So, okra can grow very well here in the Boston area. So, finding local producers who grow okra. So yeah, it does kind of fall on us to create those resources for ourselves. And it's unfortunate that mainstream grocery stores, they kind of have a blueprint of like what produce you typically find in there, and it's a shame that they don't expand more often to include some more of these types of foods, unless there's usually a typically high population. But even in in an area like I live in Boston, you still often don't see some of those foods that are there, even though where I live in Rosendale, we have a large Dominican population. So unless you go to a Dominican store, you're not going to find those foods. So it's a real kind of sadness that we don't see that reflected in the mainstream. And then from a nutrition perspective, we don't see those being talked about as part of a healthy diet. We're often told, oh, plantains, like, because there's not much information on that in our textbooks, we tend to not think of that as being a healthy alternative to some of these higher processed foods as a way of moving away from like that SAD diet, right? That standard American diet. And interestingly enough, like we tend to think about when I was mentioning food trends just a little while ago, there's an interesting way that food trends tend to co-opt some of our natural food waste. So for example, even just the idea of the paleo diet, right, is this idea that we're supposed to like go back to what our ancestors, would hunt and would gather. But there's a disconnect of just like, well, whose ancestors are you talking about? And that diet tends to have a very specific blueprint of, what you can and cannot eat. But a lot of that doesn't reflect what my ancestors ate, right? So this idea is kind of, for lack of a better term, is kind of whitewashed in a way.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's just like when they demonize rice, for example, I was like, my
Hmm.
culture has been eating rice, basmati rice for centuries, and we
Right.
never had these issues with diabetes and heart disease. And all of a sudden now we can't have any rice because it's a carb and then they're lumping it all together, like even plantains and bananas. It's like, okay, there's a banana and there's a plantain, the very different makeup,
Right.
right? Where
Hmm.
plantains are healthier for you. But it's a matter of educating. So, what do you think is standing in the way of educating these communities? And is the community even open to being educated? Are they open to changing and
Hmm.
eating differently?
I think that BIPOC communities are certainly very interested in learning their own ancestral and their own ancestral foodways. I think what's a big challenge is that, first of all, if we don't have access to those foods, like if we can't access land to grow those foods so that we can teach ourselves about those foods, or if we can't procure those foods in local stores, whether they're your typical mom and pop type of thing or in a mainstream grocery store, if we don't see them, then it's out of sight, out of mind. So that's the first thing, is we need to deliberately create spaces where we are growing these foods, or we have access to these foods, where we're asking for grocery stores to carry these foods, right? A grocery store is not going to carry something if there's no demand for it, because they're not going to see a possibility of profit there. First thing is we need to make those demands. We need to kind of create those for ourselves. And then I think the other piece is just also having a connection with our ancestry, and just kind of learning the importance of what some of these foods mean to us, not just from a culinary perspective, but how are these foods important to us because they helped with physical ailments, or they helped us with healing. So for example, I remember growing up, the first time I had papaya, the seeds, the little black seeds, I accidentally ate one. It was the worst tasting thing in my life. And I said something to my father. He's like, they're actually very good anti-parasitic. I was just like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. So even just like knowing like those types of things, is really important, and it adds to this sense of our sense of identity, right? Like if we have a connection with our food and what our food means, we have a connection to ourselves and our ancestral identity, and that has a huge impact on our self-esteem as well, and our ability to generate confidence and self-actualization. Is particularly in a world that tends to hide us away, or kind of poo-poo our types of food ways, things like that.
Well, when you grow up with the standard American diet being considered the ultimate way to eat,
Right.
you kind of distance yourself from your traditional foods. And I know we did that. We came here. I mean, I was an immigrant. I was 9 years old when we came here, and we didn't want to eat the traditional foods. And like okra was the most disgusting thing that you could offer me. And now that I'm older, I'm
Yeah.
beginning to understand the benefits of some of the traditional foods that we were eating, and even the traditional spices and remedies and treatments that we used to look down on. And now as an adult, and now that the more I know about this stuff, the more I value it and cherish
Yeah.
it. But we're not. It's almost like we're shamed, right, about having this ethnic food that we have and the way we eat.
Yeah.
So is that what you mean by being gaslit? When it comes to diet and nutrition?
Yeah, I certainly do believe. I know it's a strong term, but I'm going to use it anyway. I do feel that there is a certain amount of gaslighting that happens when we're talking about our ancestral foods and things. I can, again, from as a dietitian who specializes in gastrointestinal issues, one of the conditions that I tend to treat the most often is IBS. And what we know now is about 2/3 of IBS cases have an underlying issue of a microbiome imbalance, what we call small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So there are studies that show that pharmaceutical treatments for SIBO and herbal treatments for SIBO, so herbs such as neem, oregano, allicin, which comes from garlic, berberine, which comes from things like golden seal flower, etc., that these herbal remedies are just as effective as the pharmaceutical ones. And yet, time and time again, when I have clients come to me with their issues of IBS, and even if they have been diagnosed with SIBO, their doctors refuse to acknowledge that herbal remedies are just as effective, even though we have studies that suggest that. Their feeling is, nope, you can only take a pharmaceutical, you can only take an antibiotic, excuse me, to treat a bacterial overgrowth. And it's like, no, that's not the case. And a lot of people end up not tolerating those pharmaceuticals just as well. So it's like, why not have those options of having the herbals be just as just as supported, seen as a valid option compared to pharmaceuticals? Like, why not give the patient that option?
I feel the same way when it comes to anti-anxiety and antidepressants. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of herbs and supplements that definitely work as well as the pharmaceuticals, but either the doctors don't really know, they don't feel comfortable, or they can control the medication more with pharmaceuticals. I don't know what it is, but definitely the pharmaceuticals often pushed first. And my goal
Mm-hmm.
is, let's do the least harm to our bodies first. Let's try lifestyle change. Let's try
Right.
dietary change. Let's change our lifestyle. Let's try these supplements. Let's change the foods that we're eating. And if we've done all of that and nothing is helping, then sure, go take the medication.
Mm-hmm.
But just take steps towards the least harm that you can do to your body before jumping into that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Yeah.
So, do you have anything else to add when it comes to nutrition and the communities of color, and how we can raise the awareness and empower people to seek this help and try the foods that are actually good for them instead of just settling for the cheapest and most convenient foods?
Absolutely. So I think, once you become aware that there's a problem, now your responsibility is to find solutions for that, right? So I think the first challenge is just becoming aware. So, I've just scratched the surface with a lot of the things that I'm bringing forth, but there's plenty of resources where people can learn a little bit more about, what does it mean to reconnect with your ancestral diet, and to move away from that standard American diet, right? Or as I like to kind of call it, it's the colonizer's diet, right? So you can look for works of like Dara Cooper, Leah Penniman, Katrina Baxter, et cetera. Like, there's plenty of people who are writing about it. And interestingly enough, the majority of people who are active in these spaces are women of color. And since this is March and where it's appropriately today is International Women's Day, I want to highlight that women are really leading the way in this particular area. But yes, to learn more about it, and then seek out if there are resources in your own community where you can either participate in growing your own food. So like what I did was I decided to volunteer at a local urban farm so that I can learn like, how do you grow your own food, right? Especially with this pandemic that we're in. I think that's highlighted for a lot of people the importance of, of just growing your own food and how therapeutic that alone in itself can be. So, and for folks who don't have the time to grow their own food, at least know, like, is there something in your area where people are doing that work and you can, support their efforts by purchasing the food that they're growing. So looking for those types of resources. I think there's also the piece of connecting with our ancestral diets and doing this type of ancestral work as kind of a way of healing trauma, right? Because being denied access to our own foods, or not seeing our foods reflected as equally healthy as things like kale or whatever else is we think of as like typical in the American dietary landscape. There's a certain trauma that happens with not seeing ourselves reflected in those ways. So kind of doing that work, talking with your local growers and seeing like what other resources are there, supporting farmers markets, things of that, and challenging yourself to try new foods, right? So people who have never tried okra, give that a try, and see how you enjoy that, see how you like that, learn how to prepare it, right? I oftentimes have clients who, they like a certain food, but because they don't know how to prepare it, they don't bother to cook that at home. So it's like, okay, so challenge yourself, learn from a chef, learn from the internet. There's plenty of tutorials, ask your parents, ask your grandparents, there's so much wealth of knowledge that's out there that we don't really think to tap into. So I want to kind of bring that more explicitly. And then when it's safe to travel again, anytime you travel to a new area, ask about the local foodways. Like the last time that I traveled, I was in Mexico, and I was part of this, me and my friends, we dance for fun, kind of socially. So we went to this dance festival. I was not having the best time of my life. So I decided to just kind of go off and do my own thing. And since I'm so passionate about food, I found that there was a local chef who was offering food tours. And I was like, this sounds great. Like I can learn more about like the food from somebody who's actually a local. And it was a wonderful experience. I learned about, the history of certain foods and how the area of Mexico I was in didn't have its own agricultural base. So a lot of the foods that you see in this area of Mexico I was in Playa del Carmen, a lot of those foods had to be brought from other parts of Mexico. So it's interesting to just kind of learn about that history and how those foods are important in different ways from those different communities. So talk to people, ask, be curious, be inquisitive, be adventurous when it comes to food.
Yeah, I mean, preparation makes a huge difference. If somebody gave me overly cooked broccoli, I will never eat it again, right? I mean, and even
Yeah.
with okra, I hated okra because of how certain people cooked it. But then I know there are other ways that you can cook it that can make it actually really good for you and really
Right.
delicious. And so just because you had it one time and you hated it doesn't mean that it's not good for you. You can try different ways, like you said.
Right.
And get good cookbooks. The library offers an amazing options as far as cookbooks for free. I mean, if you sign up with your library card and get Hoopla Digital, there's all these free books at your fingertips, all these recipe books, cookbooks, just different types of diets that you're interested in. You can access all that for free from the library. So do take advantage of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this was a really interesting discussion. I didn't really see how this was connected to mental health, but as I can even, it brought up, triggered my own connection as far as my concerns about the food of the future and when it comes to mental health. So thank you so much. Where can people find you and connect with you and learn more about what you do?
Yeah. So if folks are wanting to connect with me either as a client or just to talk more about, food activism and food spaces, I can be reached through my website, which is insightnutrition.online. I'm also on Facebook under that business name. I'm also on Instagram. I believe it's Insight Nutrition .rachel or .rdn. I'm still new to Instagram, so I'm still learning that. So through my website would be the best way to connect with me.
I will link all of those in your show notes. So if people want to reach out, they can directly connect there in case they couldn't catch what you just said.
Sounds good. I talk fast. I'm from Philly, so I can't help it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time and having this conversation. I hope people find it useful, and I hope that people can really get alarmed as to what's going on with our food, because if we don't take back control, we're going to suffer mentally as well as physically moving forward. And this is why it's such an important topic. And I wanted to have this discussion with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.